Welcome to the Mormon Theories podcast, where it is my sole province to dig up hidden mysteries and new things for my listeners. My name is Ryan Hinckley, and I sure have some new things for you today. Ever since Joseph Smith published the Book of Abraham in 1842, people have wondered where Kolob is. Is it a star? Is it a planet? Is it even real? Or is it just a symbol for Christ? Well, today we're going to dive deep into the theory that Kolob is the star known as Sirius. This theory is not new. I didn't come up with it. Many others before me have suggested that Kolob might be Sirius, but nobody has explored the depths of this theory like I have. My research has revealed tons of new insights and evidence pointing to Sirius being the Kolob of the Book of Abraham. In fact, I think that Kolob being Sirius is a key that can unlock the rest of the astronomy contained in the Kirtland Egyptian papers. So, if you're interested to learn how Kolob governs the earth and how one day is equal to 1,000 years, this episode is for you. If you're interested in unlocking the long-held mysteries of Facsimile 2 or the actual location of God's throne among the stars, this episode is for you. Heck, if you're interested in unlocking the mysteries of the solar system and the galaxy in which we live, this episode is for you. And so, without further ado, I present the theory that Kolob is Sirius. You've heard about Kolob, but you've never heard this much about Kolob, believe me. Okay, so this video will be split into three main parts. After I lay the groundwork, we'll dive into the evidence that Kolob is Sirius. This will be the bulk of the video. And then after that, we'll discuss the evidence that Oliblish is a star in Orion's belt. And then we'll finish with the evidence that the throne of God is located in the Beehive Cluster. This stuff is truly fascinating, so I hope you'll stick with me. I found so much evidence for the Sirius theory that I couldn't fit it all into one episode, so you are watching part 1 of a series on Kolob. Kolobology is the study of all things related to the star Kolob, is found in Joseph Smith's Book of Abraham. I'm pretty sure I made this word up, but I think it should be a thing. Kolobology, in my definition, also extends to all other astronomical aspects tied to the Egyptian papers of Joseph Smith, which we'll get to in time. Today's presentation will, I believe, advance Kolobology more than anything has before. But in the process, I'm going to ask you to have an open mind. There are quite a few things in this presentation that will challenge what you learned in school. It will force you to think outside the box and consider new ideas and concepts that you never thought were possible. So please know that science hasn't figured everything out yet, and what we're about to hear is a theory that can explain some of the weird problems that science has yet to solve. In Mormon scripture, Kolob appears in the Book of Abraham. It's important to remember that Abraham was a Sumerian for the first 70 or so years of his life, and that later he moved from Mesopotamia into Egypt. Therefore, we should not be surprised to find both Mesopotamian and Egyptian elements in our study of Kolob. As a quick example of this, I've pointed out before that Facsimile 3, which is from an Egyptian Book of Breathings, appears to be a copy of a much earlier Sumerian motif. You can see the 3 people before a seated individual and the 2 people holding hands. You can also see there is an astronomical aspect to these older Sumerian images, which I find interesting because Joseph Smith wrote that Facsimile 3 was, quote, Abraham reasoning upon the principles of astronomy in the king's court. Close quote. Check the show notes for a link to an article I wrote about this. So, is it possible that Abraham's inspired knowledge of the stars was informed by his Sumerian background? Keep that question in mind as we proceed. The beginning of July 1835 is when Joseph Smith purchased the Egyptian papyri and mummies, but it wasn't until the 1st of October 1835 that something really interesting happened as it pertains to Kolob. The entry in Joseph's journal for that date says, quote, October 1st, 1835. This afternoon labored on the Egyptian alphabet in company with brothers Oliver Cowdery and William W. Phelps. The system of astronomy was unfolded. End quote. Now, unfortunately, we don't know what that entailed exactly when the system of astronomy was unfolded, but I think maybe we'll find some clues as we go along. And if we look a little bit closer at the 3 men who were present here, we might be able to glean some of those clues. First, there's Joseph Smith. After the October 1835 unfolding of the system of astronomy, he published the Book of Abraham in the spring of 1842, and he also taught a lot of astronomical things that seemed to support modern science. Oliver Cowdery was promised by the Lord that he would assist in translating ancient documents. He was also promised by the Lord that he would find out great and marvelous mysteries. Perhaps this was part of it. And W. W. Phelps, he's the guy who wrote If You Could Hide a Kolob, which is a favorite in the hymn book, the old hymn book, not the new one. Interestingly, he suggested in 1857 that Kolob was Sirius. He wrote a poem in which he said, "Shine you with the stars tonight, where the dog stars ever eye us. As the upper sons of light, what if Kolob is Sirius? God, whose atom with a madam brought our garden seeds from there, nightly singing, we are here." He very well might have been the very first person to suggest that Kolob was Sirius, although don't quote me on that. So what did these three guys know? What did they learn that day? It's an interesting question. I used two main sources to gather information about Kolob, and those sources are, first, the grammar and alphabet of the Egyptian language, which I will call the Gael, because it feels weird to call it the Ga-El. The last part of this document is likely what was produced when the system of astronomy was unfolded to Joseph Oliver and W. W. Phelps. And the second main source is, of course, the Book of Abraham text, as you have it in your copy of the Pearl of Great Price. Alright, now that I laid the groundwork, let's get into the evidence. Is Kolob Sirius? The best place to start is to point out that Sirius is by far the brightest star in the sky. Of all the stars we can see with our naked eye, Sirius appears the brightest to us. This sounds very much like what the Lord said to Abraham in chapter 3, verse 16, where he said, "Kolob is the greatest of all the Kokabim that thou hast seen." Kolob is also referred to as the Great One in the Book of Abraham, and the Gael calls it the greatest body of the heavenly bodies that was ever discovered by man. The fact that Sirius is the brightest star automatically makes it special and should definitely put it on your Kolob radar. But let us continue. Sirius is located in the constellation called Canis Major, which means the Great Dog. According to one article, Sirius has consistently been called the dog star since the beginnings of Mesopotamian civilization. This is highly interesting because Kolob may come from the Semitic root KLB, which anciently meant dog. Apparently, the Assyrians called Sirius Kalbu Shamash, or dog of the sun. Now, is this some huge coincidence, or is the name Kolob a clue as to which star it actually is? Interestingly, about 1 year before Joseph obtained the papyri, he was gifted a dog by a man named Samuel Baker. We don't know what this dog's original name was, but at some point Joseph was calling it Old Major. This, of course, evokes Canis Major. Fascinatingly, the first reference to the name Old Major for this dog appears in March 1839 in a letter that Joseph wrote to Emma from Liberty Jail. So, it is possible that he named the dog Old Major after the system of astronomy was unfolded unto him, but we can't say so for sure. Back to Sirius. In 1862, it was confirmed that Sirius is actually two stars, one bright one, Sirius A, and one invisible one, Sirius B. I say invisible because it's just so small and dim next to Sirius A that we can't see it without a telescope. Sirius B is about the same size as Earth and is a white dwarf, which is kind of like a giant, fiery, crystallized ball. This fact may pique a lot of people's interest because the Book of Abraham says that Kolob is near to the throne or residence of God, and D&C 130 states that God lives on a globe like a sea of glass and fire. And so, as the theory goes, if Sirius A is Kolob, then perhaps Sirius B is where God lives. It's an intriguing idea for sure, and I even wrote a blog post about it several years ago, which you can find in the show notes. But I have to say that I don't think it's correct. You see, today I'm going to offer an even more compelling theory about where God's throne is, one that's far more grounded in the historical sources and observable astronomy than the Sirius B idea. We'll get to that later in the God's throne portion of this episode, so keep listening for that. But let's keep going because there's a lot more linking Kolob to Sirius. Sirius was actually a very important star to the ancient Egyptians. A shaft in the Great Pyramid of Giza was aligned to Sirius, and the Egyptian calendar was based on the heliacal rise of Sirius. You see, because of how the sun moves through the zodiac each year along the ecliptic, not all the stars are visible all year round. I mean, during the day, you can't see any stars, right? But there are stars there, it's just that the sun's superior light blocks them out. Well, Sirius is invisible like this for about 70 days each year, but after this time period, you can start to see Sirius rise in the east just before sunrise. This is called the heliacal rise. To the ancient Egyptians, watching for the heliacal rise of Sirius was of the utmost importance because it happened right before the annual flooding of the Nile River. And they depended on this flood to bring water and nutrients into their fields so they could plant crops, yield fruit, and survive. So they saw Sirius as the herald of this life-bringing flood. That's why they revered it, and that's why it marked the beginning of their calendar. Let me show you what the heliacal rise of Sirius looks like. Okay, this is Stellarium on July 26th, 2026. And if we get really close to sunrise, and as the sun comes up, you can see the light start to shine. And then right here, you see a star that appears right as the sun is starting to come up. That's Sirius. And it doesn't last for very long. It doesn't last for very long because as the sun comes up, it overtakes its light and you can't really see it anymore. That's the heliacal rise of Sirius, when it first becomes visible after 70 days of invisibility. Sirius also stands out in a big way because it doesn't seem to move with the other stars. Allow me to explain. You see, there's this well-known thing called the precession of the equinoxes, where the background of fixed stars in the sky slowly rotates at a rate of about 1 degree every 72 years. This is how the North Star is Polaris now, but was something else in the past. You've probably heard that. Well, fascinatingly, it appears that Sirius does not follow this rule of precession. In other words, it does not seem to precess the same way as all the other stars do. One commenter on this strange phenomenon wrote, quote, "The fact that Sirius seems to maintain its position relative to the position of the sun was a surprise to most scientists aware of precession when it was first noticed by the French scientific community following the Egyptian discoveries of Napoleon and the Dendera zodiac in the early 1800s. Another author wrote, quote, "For it is remarkable that owing to the precession of the equinoxes on the one hand and the movement of Sirius on the other, the position of the sun with respect to Sirius is displaced in the same direction almost exactly to the same extent." End quote. We'll revisit this concept later on, but for now, just know that this is yet another example of why Sirius is special. Back to Kolob. In facsimile 2, Joseph Smith identified figure 1 as Kolob. Our friends at the CES letter point out that Egyptologists look at figure 1 and say it represents the four-headed ram god, a form of Khnum, also known as Khnum. Now, Khnum is a very interesting god to be drawn here because the Egyptians associated Khnum with, get this, the annual flooding of the Nile River. According to Wikipedia, Khnum, quote, held the responsibility of regulating the annual inundation of the river, end quote. So, if I've got this straight, the figure that Joseph Smith said was the star Kolob is the same Egyptian god that regulated the annual flooding of the Nile, which was famously heralded by the heliacal rise of the star Sirius. Isn't that amazing? I feel like I could just end this episode right there, but we've only just begun scratching the surface of the body of evidence that Kolob is Sirius. So, if you want your mind to continue to be blown, keep watching. Before moving on, I feel it's beneficial to show this map. This is a map of the Nile and some surrounding cities pertinent to our discussion today. At the north, we see where the pyramids are. Further south, you'll see a place called Dendera. There was an important zodiac found there, which I believe holds some very important keys to Kolobology. Not too far from there is Luxor, which is where the Abraham papyri was reportedly discovered. And then, at the farthest south, there's a place called Aswan, where the cult of Sirius was located. All of these locations are important, especially those three in the south. In Aswan, there's an island called Elephantine. Notably, it had quite the large presence of Jewish refugees following the destruction of Jerusalem in 587 BC, and that definitely merits further investigation, because the Jews are, of course, connected to Abraham and thus the Kolob. But, more importantly, Elephantine was the center of the cult of Khnum. The ruins of his temple are still visible there. And historical evidence indicates that the heliacal rise of Sirius was being tracked in Elephantine, because it's so far south and the Nile flows from south to north. Elephantine would see the annual flood before the rest of Lower Egypt. They would also see the heliacal rise of Sirius before their northern counterparts, due to latitude differences, and so it was a very important job for them to watch for the star. This, again, is more evidence that the star Sirius was indeed associated with the god Khnum, which, as we've covered, Joseph Smith identified as Kolob. Even more evidence that Khnum was seen as almost interchangeable with Sirius comes from the Dendera zodiac I mentioned earlier. I combed through the zodiac looking for appearances of Khnum and found him quite a bit, actually. Fascinatingly, every time he shows up, it seems to align with some important point associated with Sirius. I wanted to include this research in this episode, but it just became too much, so I'll have to explain this in part 2. But for now, my working hypothesis is that Khnum's appearances in the Dendera zodiac prove that he was meant to be a representation of Sirius. Now, as I believe I said at the beginning, Kolobology is much bigger than just Kolob. It's an ongoing study. So, before we move on, I'd like to define these two terms which come from the Book of Abraham, Kokab and Kokabim. Kokab means star, and Kokabim means stars. This is simple enough to remember, right? Well, in the Gale, Kolob is listed as one of 15 fixed stars. 3 of these are called the Grand Central Powers or stars, and the rest are called the 12 fixed stars. These 15 stars are apparently a special category of Kokabim. There are thousands of stars we can see with the naked eye, but in the Gale, only 15 of these fixed stars are mentioned. I propose that these are the governing ones that the Lord mentions in Abraham 3, verse 3. Kolob is just one of the governing ones, but interestingly, it also seems like it is governed by the 3 grand central stars, but we'll get to that later. But I bring these up because of this. The Gale suggests that Kolob, in its motion, is swifter than the rest of the 12 fixed stars. Well, yet another reason that Sirius stands out is that it has a higher proper motion than most other stars. In addition to precession, each star has its own vector of motion. They're all moving around up there in their own way and speed. This is called proper motion. Here I've compiled a list of 15 of the brightest stars and their proper motions. Sirius is the 3rd fastest on this list, with a speed of 1.33 arcseconds per year. Of course, if Sirius is Kolob and the Gale is true, then the top 2 stars on this list must not be a part of the 12 fixed stars, which is reasonable. But this shows that Sirius is moving very quickly compared to other stars. And once again, yet another characteristic of Sirius seems to point to it being Kolob based on the text that we have. But that's not all we have on proper motion. The Gale actually might give a speed for Kolob's motion. After pointing out that Kolob is the swiftest of the 12 fixed stars, it gives a speed of, quote, 1 cubit of times signifies 3 days. Therefore, that which is appointed to run 3 days runs 1 cubit according to the measure of time in cubits, end quote. Now, if we say that days here are Kolob days of 1,000 Earth years, and we use Hollis R. Johnson's theory that 1 cubit is equal to 1 degree, then we can actually compare this possible Kolob speed from the Gale to the known proper motion of Sirius. We know Sirius has a proper motion of 1.33 arcseconds per year. If you convert that into degrees, then convert that to cubits using Brother Johnson's conversion rate, and then convert the years to Kolob days, guess what you get? You get the actual proper motion of Sirius to be 1.11 cubits per 3 Kolob days, which is almost exactly the same as the Gale figure of 1 cubit for 3 days. Isn't that wild? To be fair though, we don't actually know that 1 cubit is equal to 1 degree, so take this with a grain of salt. But I do find this to be some interesting potential evidence that Kolob is Sirius. Now, a fundamental concept that's important for everybody to learn about Sirius is something called the Sothic cycle. I'll try to explain it. The ancient Egyptians had a 365-day calendar, kind of like us, but it had no leap years. So, since a year is actually more like 365 and a quarter days long, this would cause the calendar to slowly drift throughout the year. Every 4 years, the first day of the year would happen 1 day earlier than it should. After 8 years, it was 2 days ahead, and so on. Well, 365 times 4 equals 1,460. So after 1,460 solar years, 1,461 Egyptian civil years would have passed, and the first day of the year would once again fall on the correct day. They call this the Sothic cycle because the heliacal rise of Sirius would not only herald the flooding of the Nile, but also the start of the year. As time went on, the heliacal rise would start later in their calendar, and it would travel through the whole calendar year until 1,460 years later. It would fall on the first day of the year once again. This cycle is important to talk about when we're considering if Kolob is Sirius for a couple of reasons. First, because Sirius was so important to the Egyptians that they designed their calendar around it. Remember, the Lord began Abraham's astronomy lesson with Kolob. Facsimile 2 calls Kolob the first creation nearest to the celestial, and the first in government. And then Abraham went and taught the Egyptians about astronomy, so it's probably safe to bet that he taught the Egyptians about the significance of Kolob. And second, some people make an argument that the Sothic cycle might explain the 1 day to 1,000 years aspect of Kolob, but we'll get to that later. Speaking of Kolob, the Lord said to Abraham, quote, I have set this one to govern all those which belong to the same order as that upon which thou standest. End quote. When I read this, I take it to mean that Kolob governs the Earth and an order of other planets, which I assume includes the Sun and all other planets in our solar system. Based on Webster's 1828 definition of order, you could read that word to mean a group or a club, kind of like Harry Potter's Order of the Phoenix, for example. In this view, the planets of our solar system are all part of the same order, and there could even be other planets out there outside of our system that are governed by Kolob. We don't know. If I'm right, then what exactly does it mean that Kolob governs our solar system? Is there evidence to suggest that Sirius governs our solar system? The answer to that question, surprisingly, is yes, there might be. So let's discuss it. Amazingly, Sirius, the Sun, and Earth all align when Earth is closest to and furthest from the Sun, as shown in this diagram. When Earth is closest to the Sun around January 4th, also called perihelion, Sirius is directly opposite Earth from the Sun. And when the Earth hits its farthest distance from the Sun around July 4th, which is called aphelion, Sirius and the Sun are exactly aligned with one another at the same right ascension. Is this a coincidence, or is it a sign that there's some kind of force stretching the Sun-Earth system in the direction of Sirius? There's a guy named Karl-Heinz Holman who owns a telescope that he's bolted into the cement so that it cannot move. And the sole purpose for this telescope is to watch for the star Sirius to cross a vertical line on the lens. As it does this day after day, he records the time that elapses between crossings. Fascinatingly, he observed that the Earth's rotation seemed to slow down at key Sirius times. He claims that he saw, quote, significant time deviations during the perihelion of 1990 and in the spring of 1989, when Sirius B passed between the Sun and Sirius. His findings are, of course, disputed by the mainstream, but if they are true, it sure looks like evidence that Sirius governs the Earth rotation somehow, which is crazy. Now, any discussion about the strange aspects of Sirius has to include mention of the Dogon. The Dogon are an African tribe that has a religion/mythology centered around the star Sirius. Interestingly, some people say that the Dogon claim to be descendants of the ancient Egyptians, the people that Abraham would have taught about Kolob. Well, according to reports, the Dogon knew things about the Sirius system long before the scientists did. For example, they knew of the existence of Sirius B, even though they don't have telescopes. Here is a Dogon drawing of the Sirius system, in which, in addition to Sirius B, they drew a third body, Sirius C. Robert Temple wrote a book called The Sirius Mystery, in which he documents the Dogon's beliefs about Sirius. According to him, the Dogon believed that, quote, Sirius B contains the germs of all things. Its movement on its own axis and around Sirius upholds all creation in space, end quote. Now, how interesting is that when you consider that the Book of Abraham not only teaches that Kolob governs the Earth, but also that the Sun receives light from the revolutions of Kolob. In the Kolbrin, which is a book of purported ancient Egyptian manuscripts, much like what the Book of Abraham alleges to be, we find a quote that sounds very similar to the Dogon's belief about Sirius B. In that book, a man named Haberis teaches the people about the three rays from the central invisible sun, which manifest all things, upholding them in stability of form. Sirius B is, of course, the invisible star in the Sirius system. Is it possible that Sirius B, revolving around Sirius A, is upholding creation, governing the Earth, and giving light to the sun, just like the revolutions of Kolob are described to do? Also among the Dogon's beliefs about Sirius B is that it acts as a creator, and that as such it must have been created before other things. According to Robert Temple, the Dogon believe that, quote, Sirius B lies at the origin of things. God created Digitaria, or Sirius B, before any other star, end quote. The Dogon calls Sirius B Digitaria, but another name for it is Po Tolo, which some suggest means profound beginning. Compare all this to what Joseph Smith wrote about Kolob, that it was the first creation, and compare it to the Gale, which calls Kolob the first beginning to the bodies of this creation, the first creation, and the eldest of all the stars. The Dogon believe that Sirius B gave birth to everything that exists, visible or invisible, and that it is, quote, consisting of a central nucleus which ejected ever larger seeds or shoots in a conical spiral motion, end quote. This, of course, sounds a lot like the central invisible sun in the Cauldron that shoots out 3 rays. Fascinatingly, the Egyptian god Khnum, who seems to be associated with Sirius by the Egyptians and with Kolob by Joseph Smith, was also known as a creator god who created other entities by spinning a potter's wheel. Does this spinning motion have anything to do with the revolutions of Kolob or the conical spiral motions of Sirius B? It is rumored that Joseph Smith taught that the Earth was created near Kolob at first, but then later ended up in its current position. Considering what the Dogon believe about Sirius B being the creator of all things, including the Earth, this is actually a pretty interesting theory. Maybe there is some truth to it. But one thing that really got me into researching the possibility that Kolob and Sirius are the same star is the evidence brought forth that our solar system might be patterned after the Sirius system. This idea came to my attention when I started looking into an alternative model for the solar system called the Tychos. It's based on the model and observations of the famous astronomer Tycho Brahe and has been fleshed out and popularized by a researcher named Simon Shack. In the Tychos, as Brahe proposed, the Earth is a sphere and spins daily, but is mostly stationary, and the Sun orbits the Earth. Now, I know that sounds completely ridiculous and backwards and wrong to all of us who grew up learning that the Earth orbits the Sun, but it's actually not as crazy as it sounds. You see, in the Tychos model, the Sun orbits the Earth and all the other planets orbit the Sun. And most importantly, the Sun and Mars are locked in a sort of binary star relationship with each other, and Earth is located in the center of mass between them. When you realize that almost all other stars that you can see are also binary systems orbiting a shared center of mass with their partners, it starts to sound a little less crazy. I don't necessarily believe this model, but I am open to it and I find it very interesting. Here's a quick clip of what this model looks like. This is the Tychosium, which you can play with for free. Find the link in the show notes. As you can see in this model, the Sun goes around the Earth and everything else goes around the Sun. Well, I'm not going to go on a huge tangent about the Tychos model today, but I will say 2 things. First, it is a fact that mainstream LDS scholars of the Book of Abraham claim that the astronomy portrayed in the Book of Abraham is geocentric, not the heliocentric astronomy we learn in school. Learning about the Tychos model, which in a way is geocentric, has helped me to better understand the astronomy in the Book of Abraham and the Gale. And second, it is my opinion that Simon Shack, this guy here on the left, has advanced Kolobology more than any other person, and he doesn't even know it. I'll show you what I mean. In his book about the Tychos, which you can read for free and which I'll link to in the show notes, Simon Shack proposes that our solar system might be a twin of the Sirius system. Through this lens, he compares the Sun to Sirius A, Mars to Sirius B, and Earth to Sirius C, which some scientists claim exist and which the Dogon believe does exist. He also compares our moon to the supposed moon around Sirius C, named Nyantolo by the Dogon. He proposes that like Earth sits in the center of mass between the Sun and Mars, Sirius C sits in the center of mass between Sirius A and B. And that's not all. He shows that the ratio of the maximum distance of Mars from Earth to its minimum distance is 7:1, which matches the apparent ratio of the distances of Sirius B from the barycenter of the Sirius system. They're both 7:1 ratios. 7 is, of course, an interesting number to run across, and as we'll see later, shows up quite a bit in Sirius. But Simon Shack goes on. He also points out that not only does our solar system share the 7:1 ratio with the Sirius system, but the size ratios of the bodies in each system are nearly identical too. Turns out that the Sun is about 205 times as large as Mars, and Sirius A is about 205 times as large as Sirius B. Are all these coincidences, or was our solar system patterned after an older system, namely the Sirius system? And why the heck would it be patterned after the Sirius system? Believe it or not, there are actually even more interesting similarities between us and Sirius that Simon Shack has pointed out, but I'm saving those for later in this presentation. It's one thing to be Sirius's twin, But is it possible that this twin, mini-me-like characteristic is a sign of something much bigger? Is it perhaps an indication that our solar system is governed by Sirius in some special way? And all that brings us to this point in the video, where we ask the question, does our solar system orbit Sirius? Remember, the Book of Abraham tells us that Kolob governs the Earth and all the planets in the same order. If Kolob is Sirius, then we have to ask what this would mean in real life. Now, before going this deep in the Kolob-Sirius theory, I had no idea that there are actually people out there who believe that the sun orbits Sirius, but there are. It's actually quite a common topic if you look in the right neighborhoods, and adherents to the idea seem to be increasing in number, as far as I can tell. One such advocate of the idea is William Brown, who wrote the following, quote, "The idea that the Earth orbits the sun, or that the sun orbits Sirius, is not revolutionary. It's just a rediscovery of lost knowledge." End quote. Like Abraham's knowledge of Kolob was lost to the world until Joseph Smith brought it back, was the knowledge that we orbit Sirius also lost? You'll remember this slide from earlier, showing that Sirius refuses to precess with the other stars. This very well could be because the sun orbits Sirius. Look at the sun. It doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't precess with the background stars. This is because we orbit it, right? This same principle would apply to any star that the sun orbits. It also would not move relative to the sun, despite the rest of the stars moving in precession. Here's a diagram made by someone else who believes we might be orbiting Sirius. They propose that the Sun-Sirius relationship is in itself like a binary star companionship, and that they orbit a common center of mass. There are a couple of really interesting things about this particular diagram that I like. First, in ancient times, there are records of people observing that Sirius was red in color. Nowadays, Sirius is blue. A binary relationship, such as this diagram, would explain how the star's color could have changed. Due to the Doppler effect, a star going away from us is red-shifted, and one coming towards us is blue-shifted. According to this, about 2,000 years ago, Sirius was moving away from us, and thus looked red. Now we're getting closer to each other, and so it looks blue. And the second thing I liked about this diagram is it divides the sun's orbit with Sirius into 12 equal parts of 2,000 years, or in other words, a 24,000 year cycle. You may recall that the precession of the equinoxes is an estimated 26,000 or so year cycle. Some proponents of the Sun-Sirius theory suggest that it's not a wobble on Earth's axis that causes precession, but rather it's a long motion around Sirius that does. Some people say there are big problems with the wobble theory, so perhaps this is a more elegant solution. I've also maybe found some evidence in the Gale to support this, but that will have to come in a future episode. Well, the Book of Abraham does not explicitly say that our planet is on an orbit around Kolob, but it does have some clues. You already know it says that Kolob governs our planet, but there's more. In Abraham chapter 3, when the Lord introduces astronomy to Abraham, he starts by pointing out Kolob, the star, and then he pretty quickly brings up the moon. Why would he do that? Well, I think I might know why. Simon Shack shows that if you use long lunar cycles, you can derive an average synodic period for the moon of 29.22 days. Then he shows that all other planets in our solar system have either synodic or orbital periods that are clean multiples of 29.22 days. I'll talk more about this in part 2. Well, interestingly enough, after Earth's daily 24-hour rotation period, the moon is the next slowest planet moving in our sky, completing one lunar cycle in around 29 days. After that, Mercury is the next slowest, taking about 116 days, and then the Sun is the next slowest, taking about 365 days, and so on through all the planets, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, etc. All of these planets are on courses in our sky, and hence move above and slower than the rotation of the Earth, which sounds just like what the Lord tells Abraham in chapter 3. Quote, "The moon moveth in order more slow. This is in order because it standeth above the earth upon which thou standest." End quote. And then the Lord says, quote, "Now the set time of the lesser light is a longer time as to its reckoning than the reckoning of the time of the earth upon which thou standest. And where these two facts exist, there shall be another fact above them. That is, there shall be another planet whose reckoning of time shall be longer still. And thus there shall be the reckoning of the time of one planet above another, until thou come nigh unto Kolob, which Kolob is set nigh unto the throne of God, to govern all those planets which belong to the same order as that upon which thou standest." End quote. So, because the Lord includes the Sun and Kolob in a list of planets visible from Earth, it stands to reason that like the Earth orbits the Sun, the Earth also orbits Kolob. This would explain why the Book of Abraham identifies Kolob as the first in government and the last pertaining to the measurement of time. It's because our entire system goes around it, and more than any other star, it acts like a planet in our sky, albeit on very long timescales. To back up this idea, let's look again at the word Kolob. Some suggest that it comes from the Semitic or Arabic root QLB, which means heart, center, or middle. How fitting is that if indeed we do orbit around it? And if the textual evidence points to us orbiting Kolob, isn't it interesting that so many people completely unrelated to Mormonism actually believe that we orbit Sirius? I might have forgotten to mention this, but I believe that the Gale and the Book of Abraham are channeled texts. Well, believe it or not, there are other channeled texts that explicitly say that our solar system orbits Sirius. Here's one by a 19th century channeler named Jacob Lorber, in which he claims that Jesus Christ himself said the following to him, quote, "And therefore, this creation period has above all others the still by you not sufficiently recognized advantage that it is in the whole of eternity and infinity the only one in which I clothed myself completely in the human flesh, and in the whole large creation man I have chosen this shell globe, and in it the central sun region of Sirius, orbited by 200 million suns, where each is orbited by many earth bodies, in particular this earth, on which you are standing now, to become myself a person, and to raise you people as my true children for the whole of infinity and eternity backwards and forwards." End quote. I think that is beautiful, that out of all his creations, the Lord chose this planet, which orbits Sirius, to come to in the flesh. Here's another one of Lorber's revelations, which states that the sun and its planets, quote, "move around the formerly mentioned central sun," end quote. Interestingly, this is dated August 1842, which was just a few months after the Book of Abraham was published for the first time. In 1875, another channeler by the name of Gottfried Meyerhofer was told, quote, "Sirius, as the next fixed star for you, is the very sun around which your whole solar system must orbit." End quote. I wonder if this 30 or so year stretch in the 1800s from Joseph Smith to Gottfried was a special time in which God wanted to reveal some things about Sirius and its role in the structure of our cosmic neighborhood. Historical records indicate that the ancient Egyptians believed that Sirius was the goddess Isis, that it was the appearance of her in the sky. To bolster this, the temple of Isis at Dendera, the place of the famous zodiac, was oriented to face 108 degrees on the azimuth, which, at that latitude, was also the precise spot on the horizon that Sirius would rise every night. Many scholars say that the Book of Abraham papyri was made during the Ptolemaic period. Well, interestingly, the Egyptians called the star Sirius Sopdet, which was also the name of one of their goddesses. By the Ptolemaic period, Sopdet and Isis were essentially morphed into the same entity. So indeed, Sirius was Isis and Isis was Sirius by the time the papyri was produced. This is interesting for so many reasons, as we'll get to. But firstly, it's fascinating to note that Isis is indeed found on facsimile 3 of the Book of Abraham. She's standing right behind the figure that Joseph Smith identified as Abraham as he reasoned upon the principles of astronomy in the king's court. Remember, Abraham's astronomy lesson began with a discussion about Kolob. Is it a coincidence that Isis, or Sirius, appears right next to him as he teaches astronomy to the Egyptians? In Egyptian mythology, Isis gave birth to the god Horus, and for some reason the Egyptians named pretty much all the visible planets in our solar system after Horus. The sun was called Horus's right eye, the moon was Horus's left eye, Jupiter was Horus, who illuminates the two lands, Saturn was Horus, bull of the sky, and Mars was called Horus the Red, or Horus of the horizon. Well, given what we've covered so far about Sirius and Kolob both somehow creating and governing our solar system, I find it highly interesting that our solar system is named after the god who Isis herself created as her son. Next, we'll look at some interesting connections to Sirius and the number 7, which is a highly significant and symbolic number, as you well know. If Kolob is indeed so important to God, would the number 7 be encoded into it? That's what I'm wondering, but I'll let you decide. As pointed out earlier, our solar system exhibits a 7-to-1 ratio just like the Sirius system does. As a reminder, this was pointed out by Simon Shack. Sirius is located very close to 7 hours of right ascension. It's actually at around 6 hours and 45 minutes, but that is, of course, super close to 7 hours. It also turns out that Sirius is the 7th closest star to Earth. What are the chances? Simon Shack has also pointed out that both the Sun and Mars are tilted at about 7 degrees, as is the Sirius system from our view, apparently. He proposes that the Sun and Mars are tilted 7 degrees in sympathy with Sirius. You gotta wonder why this is. Also, apparently the orbits of Mercury and Venus about the Sun are also tilted about 7 degrees, like they follow the Sun's tilt. But it's not only Mars and the Sun. Turns out the Moon also has a 7-degree tilt. This is fascinating considering the central drive shaft theory of the Moon posited by Simon Shack, but we'll have to delve deeper into that in part 2. Israelite connections. Okay, let's shift gears. We know that Abraham knew and likely taught about Kolob in Egypt. And we know that his descendants, namely his grandson Jacob and his great-grandson Joseph and all 12 tribes of Israel, spent something like 400 years in Egypt. So, the Israelites should have known about Kolob from their venerable ancestor Abraham, and they should have known about the importance of Sirius merely by living in Egypt. So, I thought it fitting to show any possible connections between the house of Israel and the star Sirius. Remember how Sirius B orbits Sirius A once every 50 years? I might have forgotten to mention that, but it's true. Well, 50 years, which is 7 times 7 plus 1, is essentially the Israelite Jubilee cycle. God told the Israelites that the 50th year would be a Jubilee for them. Is it possible that Sirius B's orbit around Sirius A is the reason for the Jubilee cycle? Other elements of Israelite worship might be derived from Sirius. Earth, the Sun, and Sirius form a 90-degree angle twice per year. This happens around April 7th and October 9th. It just so happens that the important Jewish feasts of Passover and Sukkot happen at around the same time. Is there some connection there? Further, the LDS Church, which I believe is the modern-day House of Israel, holds General Conference on the first weekend of both April and October, again, right around when Sirius is at a right angle to us. Another important Israelite cycle is 490 years. If you divide the 1,460-year Sothic cycle by 3, you get 486 and 2/3, which is very close to 490 years. The reason I divided it by 3 is because the ancient Egyptians would divide their civil calendar into 3 seasons: flood, growth, and harvest. Perhaps the 490-year cycle of the Israelites is a macrocosm of one season in the Egyptian civil year. It's kind of complicated. Maybe I'll explore it more in part 2. And there's even more linking Sirius to the House of Israel, but for the sake of time, I'm going to have to show those in part 2. To finish off this section, I'd just like to show that researcher Ed Goebel has deciphered figure 11 on facsimile 2 and discovered it is a Hebrew calendar. Look how close this calendar is to the Sirius-associated god Khnum in the center, which Joseph Smith identified as Kolob. Perhaps it's a clue that the two are related somehow. While Ed has told me that he doesn't subscribe to the Kolob-Sirius theory, he has done some truly fascinating work on the Book of Abraham. I actually interviewed him in episode 8 of Mormon Theories. Check it out. There's a link in the show notes. Well, any discussion about finding the actual location of Kolob should take into consideration that the Book of Abraham says that the sun gets its light from Kolob. And so we're going to do just that. And I guarantee you that you have never heard this stuff before. This is cutting-edge Kolobology, my friends, that offers new explanations for things from the Book of Abraham that you've wondered about your whole life. Well, if you're like me, you've wondered about them your whole life. And like a lot of other things in this video, it's going to ask you to open your mind to possibilities that you've never considered before. Figure 5 of facsimile 2 states that the sun borrows its light from Kolob, and that it receives its power through the medium of Klyphlos-Isis or Ha-Kokabim, receiving its light from the revolutions of Kolob. There's a lot to unpack here, and it's somewhat confusing, but I believe that looking closely at some of these unique names given here can yield some productive results in our quest. So, let's look at Klyphlos-Isis first. The Gale pretty clearly defines Phlos-Isis as the sun, and I find it very interesting that the last part of Phlos Isis is Isis, the Egyptian goddess associated with Sirius. It appears that in addition to Sirius, Isis was also sometimes associated with the sun. Curious, isn't it? Well, the word Phlos Isis is clearly embedded within the word Kli Phlos Isis. Consulting the Book of Mormon Onomasticon, we see that they suggest that Kli Phlos Isis means, quote, Isis draws near and comes forth, end quote. Quite the interesting etymology if indeed Sirius is lending light to the sun somehow. Further, they suggest that the Kli in Kli Phlos Isis might derive from the Egyptian root Qri or the Coptic Kol, which means come, go, roll, wrap, rotate. Remember how the sun receives light from the revolutions of Kolob? Isn't that fascinating? Well, from all this, I propose that the word Kli Phlos Isis means the coming forth of the sunlight. In this way, it is the process through which the sun gets its light. This is a theory, of course, but it seems to fit Figure 5's explanation quite nicely. The next word we need to look at is Ha-Kokau-Beam. We learned early on in this episode that Kokau-Beam means stars, so that part is pretty straightforward. But now we have to grapple with Ha. Well, there was an Egyptian god named Ha, or He. He was the god of infinity, and his name meant flood, or millions. These are key words here, so pay close attention. Ha was married to a snake-headed goddess named Hauhet. She was quite a looker, wasn't she? You know what they say. Love is blind. But anyway, this possibly links the word Ha to serpents. And so, putting all this together, I propose that Ha-Kokau-Beam means serpent stars, flood of stars, or, more recognizable to us, Milky Way stars. You see, to the ancients, the Milky Way stars were a cosmic serpent stretching across the heavens. Here's a carving from Karahan Tepe, a site not too far from the more famous Göbekli Tepe that dates to some 11,000 years ago. It's a snake whose form matches up almost perfectly with the band of Milky Way stars. To support that this was actually a representation of the Milky Way, let's zoom out and look at Karahan Tepe as a whole. Some really smart researchers named Andrew Collins and Hugh Newman have discovered that the main enclosure at Karahan Tepe is shaped like the head of a snake, and that it is aligned perfectly to the light of the winter solstice sunrise to shine through a small opening and illuminate a serpent-like head carved into the rock. And, just in case you didn't know, at winter solstice, the sun is positioned almost directly in front of the galactic center of our Milky Way galaxy, which coincides with the head of the cosmic serpent. And so, I propose that the word Ha-Kokau-Beam is a reference to the stars contained within the Milky Way band. All the stars are Kokau-Beam, but the Ha-Kokau-Beam are a special category that exist along the plane of the galaxy in which we live. There's some more really interesting stuff that supports this theory, but that'll have to come in part 2. For now, let's turn to the Gale to see how well this theory fits the data we have. This is a slide I made showing the 5 degrees of explanation given for the word Phlos Isis in the Gale. We'll read through each one, starting at the bottom and keeping in mind that the sun somehow gets its light from other stars. First degree, the king of day or central moving planet from which those other governing moving planets receive their light. Second degree, the king of day or the central moving planet from which the other governing moving planets receive their light, having a less motion, slow in its motion, the earth's chief joy. Third degree, the sun in its affinity with earth and moon, signifying their revolutions, showing the power the one has with the other. Fourth degree, the night degree of light, the cheering the face of millions of planets. Fifth degree, the highest degree of light, because its component parts are light, the governing principle of light, because God has said, "Let this be the center for light, and let there be bounds that it may not pass. He hath set a cloud round about in the heavens, and the light of the grand governing of 15 fixed stars center there, and from there it is drawn by the heavenly bodies according to their portions, according to the decrees that God hath set, as the bounds of the ocean, that it should not pass over as a flood, so that God has set the bounds of light, lest it pass over and consume the planets. Okay, after reading that last one, can you see how much it sounds like the sun is getting its light from the center of our galaxy through a chain of other stars? To show this another way, I made this diagram. It's simple, but it shows the stars of the Milky Way, or the Ha-Kokau beam, giving light to Kolob, which in turn gives light to the sun. This explains Figure 5's explanation, which says that the sun receives its power through the medium of Clyphos Isis, which I like to call the process of the coming forth of the sunlight. Or in other words, the sun receives its power from the Ha-Kokau beam, the Milky Way stars, which are the stars represented by numbers 22 and 23, receiving light from the revolutions of Kolob. Really interesting stuff here to consider. Okay, now that we've covered that, let's get back to Sirius, because if it's Kolob, it's got to fit what the book says. Is it at all possible that the sun somehow gets its light from Sirius? If so, you would expect there to be some signs. All I can do at this point is show some interesting correlations between the sun and Sirius. The number 25 shows up quite a bit in all this. Sirius A is as luminous as 25 suns. Mars orbits the sun about 25 times for each orbit of Sirius B. In other words, the sun is 1/25th as luminous as Sirius A, and the orbit of Mars is 1/25th of the orbit of Sirius B. That's interesting. And looking through the Tychos lens, it's possible, although absolutely not proven yet, that the sun's orbit is 1/25th of the orbit of Sirius A. Might there be some connection there? I don't know. I'm just presenting interesting facts. Also of note is that while Sirius B makes one 50-year orbit, the moon will go through about 25 times 25 lunar cycles. In my research, I also came upon a 1,000-year cycle observed in the sun, called the Eddy cycle. I figured if there is some reason that Kolob time is a factor of 1,000 compared to ours, perhaps a 1,000-year cycle would show up in the sun. And there it is. It's interesting to note, but again, doesn't prove anything. It also serves as a good segue into talking about Kolob time. If we're really going to pin Sirius down as Kolob, then we have to explain this whole notion of Kolob time, 1,000 years on Earth being one day on Kolob and all that jazz. And again, I'm going to offer some explanations that you've never heard before, so buckle up. I think Kolob time is very often misunderstood, and rightly so because it is confusing, but I will offer some clarity. Let's read what the Book of Abraham actually says about it. Quote, "The Lord said unto me by the Urim and Thummim, that Kolob was after the manner of the Lord, according to its times and seasons in the revolutions thereof. That one revolution was a day unto the Lord, after his manner of reckoning, it being 1,000 years, according to the time appointed unto that whereon thou standest. This is the reckoning of the Lord's time, according to the reckoning of Kolob." End quote. To help us think better about this, let me ask you a question. How long is one revolution of Earth? What would you say to this question? Because by my count, there are at least 6 different revolutions that the Earth is subject to. So which one am I asking about? The Earth revolves around the sun annually. It revolves on its axis daily. It revolves through the axial precession wobble every 26,000 years. It revolves around the Earth-Moon barycenter. It revolves around the galaxy every 230 million years. And the Earth-Moon system takes about 27 to 29 days to revolve around itself and reset. So to ask what one revolution of the Earth is not actually a very easy question, is it? And so let's look at the Abraham 3 verse 3 quote again. It really only says that one revolution of Kolob is a day unto the Lord. In other words, just like the Earth, Kolob must have multiple revolutions, and only one of them is equal to 1,000 years. Does that make sense? And so now I ask you another question. How long is one revolution of Sirius? Just like the Earth, there are many revolutions going on in the Sirius system. We've got a 50-year orbital period for Sirius B. The Dogons say Sirius B rotates once on its axis per year. Scientists say Sirius A rotates once on its axis every 5.5 days. And then there's Sirius C, which could have an orbit between 32 and 50 years according to the Dogon. Which one is it? Perhaps it's the 1,460-year Sothic cycle? How can we know where to look? The point I'm trying to get across is that we like to simplify everything and say that Kolob is a star that rotates once on its axis every 1,000 years. but chances are that the truth is far more complicated than that. So let's explore some possible revolutions of Sirius for a bit. We'll start with the Sothic cycle. Others, including the blogger Jared J., have proposed that Sirius is Kolob, and that the Sothic cycle is what the Lord was talking about when he said one revolution of Kolob is 1,000 years. And indeed, it is interesting that Sirius has a near 1,000-year cycle associated with it. No other star has anything like this, to my knowledge. And although 1,460 is 46% bigger than 1,000 is, if you round it to the nearest 1,000, you still get 1,000. So maybe that's what God was saying. Maybe he was saying that Kolob's cycle is so big that it's like 1,000 years. What's the difference to a man like Abraham, whose lifespan was far less than 1,000 years? It's such a long revolution that you'll never see it. Another thing that I was astonished by when researching this was looking at the number 1,460, like the ancient Babylonians would have. They used a sexagesimal system, which is base 60. You learned math in a decimal or base 10 numbering system, but the Babylonians used a base 60 system. It's why we have 60 seconds in a minute, and 60 minutes in an hour, and 360 degrees in a circle, and so on. Well, if you convert 1,460 to sexagesimal, you get 24:20. Or, in other words, 24 60s and 20 60ths. And it struck me how insanely close that looked like how we would write 24 hours and 20 minutes. And if you recall, there are 24 hours in one day for us. Or, put differently, one day for us is 24 60s, because an hour is 60 minutes. So, is this what God was getting at when he taught Abraham about Kolob? Was God thinking in base 60 and saying that Sirius's Sothic cycle approximates 24 hours to him? And then I wondered, do we have 24 hours in our day to begin with because of the Sothic cycle of Sirius? Like, is each day of our lives a microcosm of the Sothic cycle? Something to ponder for sure. This blew my mind. Another possibility is that the 1,000-year revolution of Kolob has to do with an orbit of Sirius A around its system's center of mass, or barycenter. Take this image of the sun as an example. The sun actually has this very complicated orbit around the barycenter of the solar system. The center of the sun only approaches the barycenter once every 39.5 years or so. Last time it happened was in 1990, and it will happen again in 2030. Here's a quick video illustration of what this orbit looks like. Now, the theory would be that like the sun takes about 40 years to come back to the barycenter, Sirius A takes about 1,000 years to come back to the center of mass of its system. And while we have no idea how long it takes Sirius A to dance around its barycenter, the numbers of comparison are intriguing and worth looking at. You see, for every 20 revolutions of Mars, the sun returns to its barycenter. So, for every 20 revolutions of Sirius B, will Sirius A return to its barycenter? That's the question. Remember, Sirius B has a 50-year orbit, and 50 times 20 is 1,000. So is this the revolution that takes 1,000 years? Maybe, guys. Again, we don't know enough to confirm this theory, but the math is super interesting to consider. And then finally, we have one of my favorite theories to explain Kolob time. I saved it for last. This table should look familiar to you. It shows that the Julian dates for the heliacal rise of Sirius barely change over the millennia, effectively showing that Sirius does not precess like the other stars do. But if you look a little bit closer at the table, you'll notice that the dates do change, ever so slowly. You'll see that the date advances about 4 days over 4,000 years, or, in other words, on average, 1 day for every 1,000 years. That's literally what this data shows, and it blew my mind when I realized it. So was this what God was talking about? Was he saying that the Julian date for the heliacal rise of Kolob changes 1 day every 1,000 years on Earth? I don't know, but I love it. Further, remember Brother Johnson's theory that 1 cubit is equal to 1 degree? Well, the sun's position against the zodiac stars changes about 1 degree every day, which means that roughly its point of rising on the horizon changes about 1 degree every day too, on average. Likewise, it appears that Sirius's heliacal rise changes about 1 degree every 1,000 years. And then you have the Gale teaching that celestial time is 1 day to a cubit, which is equal to 1,000 years. It just fits so stinking well. I really think there might be something there, but what do you think? Given all we've discussed today, what is your favorite theory for Kolob time? Let me know in the comments. Okay, well, that concludes our section about the evidence that Kolob is Sirius, at least for part 1. And are you convinced that Sirius is Kolob yet? It's okay if you're not. There's still a lot more info to this theory. We're not done yet. The rest of the presentation will focus on the identity of another star mentioned in the Book of Abraham and the mysterious location of God's throne. And indeed, we can't be done talking about Kolob without talking about Oliblish. I would imagine that you might not even know what Oliblish is, nor have you ever heard anyone really talk about it before. The word Oliblish has never once been uttered at General Conference, I can tell you that. Well, that all changes today, my friends, except probably the General Conference part, because in order to fully understand Kolob and what it might be, we have to dive into Oliblish too. They are connected, and I believe that the theory that Kolob is Sirius is a key to unlocking the identity of Oliblish as well. Oliblish's only mention in Scripture is Figure 2, a facsimile 2, where we learn that it stands next to Kolob. It's the next nearest grand governing creation to the residence of God, and it governs other planets. That, and its picture as a man-like being holding a staff, is all we're given about it. So, in order to learn more, we have to look at the Gale. In the Gale, Oliblish is said to be one of 3 grand central stars or powers. And if you're like me, your whole life you've been aware of 3 very prominent stars in the sky. They're quite possibly the 3 easiest stars to spot and identify in the night sky, and they are Orion's belt. So, is it possible that if Kolob is Sirius, Oliblish is one of the stars in Orion's belt? The names of the 3 stars in Orion's belt are Alnitak, Alnilam, and Mintaka. In this theory, Oliblish would be Alnitak because it is the one that stands closest to Sirius. Look how close they are to each other. In fact, if you want to find Sirius in the sky, first find Orion's belt and use it like an arrow that points right to Sirius. Works every time. This then explains beautifully how Oliblish stands next to Kolob. Oh, but this isn't all. Apparently, Alnitak was important to the ancient Egyptians too, because the king's chamber in the Great Pyramid was aligned to it. Further, in ancient Egyptian art, the god Sa, which is the constellation Orion, was often depicted next to Sopdet, or Sirius. And get this, he was depicted as a man holding a staff. Look at how similar these look to the guy drawn in facsimile 2. Especially look at this bottom right image, which is from the Dendera zodiac. Sa's staff is shaped very similar to Oliblish's. Is this a clue that Oliblish is a part of Orion? Sa was not only shown close to Sopdet, but Sopdet was his consort. He was also associated with Osiris, whose consort was Isis, who we've spoken about. So again, we have a connection between Sirius and Orion's belt. Orion can be seen as the husband of Sirius. There's a lot to explore about these connections, but I'm going to have to punt a lot of them to part 2. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on that. Another thing that made my jaw drop while studying this stuff was what the Gale says about the Earth's relationship to these 3 grand central stars, one of which is Oliblish. Strangely, it says that the Earth experiences an attraction to these stars, and that the Earth is under the government of these stars. Mind you, Kolob is not one of these 3 stars, so how could they be exerting any kind of attraction on the Earth? Well, if we view these 3 central stars as Orion's belt, we can actually explain what the heck the Gale is talking about here. You see, the Earth is actually tilted towards Orion's belt. I know that sounds weird, but it's true. We usually talk about how the Earth's axis is tilted toward the star Polaris, and that is true. But it's just as true to say that the Earth's equator is tilted towards Orion's belt. This makes it so Orion's belt always rises due east and sets due west and is always along the celestial equator. Always. Is this what the Gale is saying? I don't know, but it's an amazing fit. Another interesting thing from the Gale about these 3 grand central stars is that they are said to govern the other 12 fixed stars mentioned in the Gale, one of which is Kolob. Now, the Joseph Smith papers has had a hard time transcribing the paragraph that I've shown here, but after examining it myself, I think it reads that Oliblish and his two companions, quote, governed the 15 fixed stars, 12 besides themselves, end quote. So what it sounds like to me is that the 12 fixed stars orbit Orion's belt. I know that sounds absolutely preposterous to anyone who is into astronomy and astrophysics, but just walk down this road with me for a minute, okay? According to scientists, our solar system is actually located in the Orion spur of the Milky Way galaxy. Here's a closer look at our galactic neighborhood. You can imagine that the Sun and some of these other nearby stars could potentially be in orbits around the three belt stars. In fact, scientists even say there's good evidence that our solar system passed through a star-forming region in the direction of Orion about 14 million years ago. In part 2, I'll get way deeper into all of this, but I'll just say there are a couple of channel texts, such as Owaspy and the Law of One, that suggest that Orion is in charge, or at least beings from Orion rule over other star systems, such as ours. Even our good channeler friend Jacob Lorber was told that while we orbit the Sun and the Sun orbits Sirius, Sirius itself orbits something else. While he didn't say exactly what that something was, we could imagine that it's Orion's belt. Here's a diagram someone made of Jacob Lorber's cosmology that I've added yellow labels to in order to visualize what might be going on in our galaxy. Perhaps we orbit Sirius, which orbits Orion's belt, which in turn orbits the galactic center. I'll dive much deeper into this topic in part 2. But what I find most fascinating about all this is that in Egyptian mythology, Osiris and Isis had a child together called Horus. I've shown earlier that Horus could be our solar system, and so I propose that this little family of Egyptian gods is telling us how the cosmos work. We, Horus, came from Sirius, Isis, who is ruled over by Osiris, Orion. And there's even a deeper creation element to this too, which I'll have in part 2. But that's enough Oliblish for now. Let's move on to the final section of this episode, God's throne. There's always been a lot of confusion around God's throne and Kolob, people thinking that God's throne is Kolob. Isis, the personification of Sirius, was even drawn with a throne on her head, which I think just added to the confusion. But I think the evidence suggests something even more fascinating and even more backed by ancient traditions. So I've thought of 2 theories that I'll present here today. The first is the theory that God's throne is the galactic plane, or the invisible line down the middle of the Milky Way serpent from head to tail. Sirius is actually pretty close to this line, as you can see here. Here's a list of bright stars and their distances in galactic latitude from the galactic plane. It's not easy finding these numbers, so I had AI generate them, so take them with a grain of salt. But as you can see, Sirius clocks in at the 6th closest of these bright stars to the galactic plane. Not super great, but this is one possibility to explain God's throne. Maybe it's right down the middle of the Ha-Kokau beam. But there is, I believe, an even better theory to explain it. And that is the theory that God's throne, as mentioned in the Book of Abraham, is the Beehive Cluster located in the constellation Cancer. To ancient Mesopotamians, the Beehive Cluster was also called the seat of Anu. This is actually super convincing to me, so stick with me here. Anu was the personification of the sky or the heavens and the king and father of the gods. To us, he would be analogous to Heavenly Father. Curiously, he was represented by an 8-pointed star. I talked about this 8-pointed star and Anu in Mormon Theories episode 13 in relation to the brother of Jared and the warrior Coriantumr. I suggest that the 8 points might have some connection to the number 8 being hidden all throughout the Book of Ether. Check out that episode for more on that. Well, the ancient Mesopotamians believed that the seat of Anu, or his throne, was located in the constellation we know now as Cancer, or the crab, and that it was specifically located in the Beehive Cluster. Now, remember, Abraham was a Sumerian, so he would have known about this. Here's an image of the Beehive Cluster highlighted within the crab, Cancer. Is the throne of God located in the Beehive Cluster, right there? The symbolism behind this possibility is absolutely amazing. For example, the Beehive Cluster is also known as Praesepe, which means manger in Latin. Manger. How fitting would it be for the God of heaven to leave his manger in the sky and appear in a manger on earth? Is this why the baby Jesus was laid in a manger after his birth? And then you have the bee imagery. If you recall, the Jaredites took bees with them on their journey to the Promised Land. I speculated in a fun article of mine that the bees were a manifestation of God, and that God appeared to the brother of Jared in a cloud or swarm of bees. Check it out, links in the show notes. Did the Jaredites, who were also from Mesopotamia, take bees with them because they believed God lived in the Beehive Cluster? And then, interestingly, there are around 11 to 13 confirmed white dwarfs in the Beehive Cluster. If God lives on a white dwarf, as DNC 130 suggests, or might suggest, then he definitely has some options in the Beehive Cluster, doesn't he? But now, if the throne of God is in the constellation of Cancer, how do we tackle the detail in the book of Abraham that Kolob is the nearest unto the throne of God? Amazingly, there's quite a bit there if you believe that Kolob might be Sirius. This animation estimates where Sirius came from eons ago, and as you can tell, it came right from the direction of the constellation Cancer. I'm not sure how accurate this is, but it's really interesting. But there's more. This is a map of the constellations with right ascension on the x-axis. As you can see, Sirius is actually pretty close to Cancer as far as right ascension goes. The Beehive Cluster is at 8 hours 40 minutes of right ascension, and Sirius is at 6 hours and 45 minutes. And interestingly, Alnitak is just a little further away at 5 hours 40 minutes. This might explain the passage about Oliblish being the next grand governing creation near to where God resides. But this chart is kind of hard to see how close Sirius really is to Cancer. So to illustrate this, let's look at Stellarium. Here's Sirius rising in the east. Now I'll select the Beehive Cluster, and look how close they are to each other when they rise. They rise at almost exactly the same time. Look at that. Now this is from Salt Lake City, but at a more southern latitude such as Aswan, Sirius rises just before the Beehive Cluster does. Like this. This is from Aswan. So maybe when the book of Abraham says Kolob is nearest to the throne of God, it means that it rises at almost the same time as the throne of God. Can any other theory explain it this well? I don't think so, because amazingly, the Cancer theory might actually explain what's going on in facsimile 2. If you take a mirror image of facsimile 2, it matches up with Sirius, Orion's belt, and Cancer perfectly. Look, we've got Sirius in blue, corresponding to Kolob, Orion in red, corresponding to Oliblish, and Cancer in yellow, lining up in the exact same spot as figure 3, which was said by Joseph Smith to be God sitting on his throne. I mean, how perfect is that? I'm telling you, Sirius being Kolob might be the key that unlocks the Book of Abraham. But the connections to facsimile 2 go even deeper than this. To the ancient Egyptians, the constellation Cancer was a scarab, represented by the god Khepri. In the 12th and final hour of the Amduat, the scarab would lead the solar bark out of the underworld, or in other words, he would push the sun out of the horizon into the eastern sky. Now, this is important, because look where the sun is located when Sirius has its heliacal rise. Here's Aswan at the time of the heliacal rise of Sirius, and look where the sun is. It's in Cancer. It's the scarab pushing the sun into the sky at the very same time that the important star Sirius is heralding the flooding of the Nile and starting the new year. Or, if this theory is correct, then the Egyptians would start their new year when Kolob rose heliacally and the sun was in the throne of God. Now, to finish up this presentation, let's return to facsimile 2 for one more look at the evidence that suggests the throne of God is in Cancer. Apparently, the papyrus that Joseph had for facsimile 2 was missing some pieces. Here on the right is an estimation of what was missing. Because of this, Joseph apparently had things drawn in to fill in the spaces. He might have used characters from other parts of the papyri, I don't know, but he drew what he drew, and that's what ended up in the facsimile that we have in our Book of Abraham. Well, notice that figure 3, which signifies the throne of God, was part of this missing portion. He's the guy sitting down on the boat with the sun over his head. Facsimile 3 is what's called a hypocephalus by the scholars, and there are some other hypocephali that are similar to Joseph that we can look at today. Given the theory that Sirius is Kolob and God's throne is Cancer, a most illuminating study then is to look at other similar surviving hypocephali and see what they have drawn in the spot that corresponds to figure 3. I think you'll be surprised what you see. This Wikipedia page has 6 of them that we can look at. Are you ready? Here we go. The first one. Look in the spot where figure 3 is and you see a scarab. That's interesting. Second one. Same spot. Oh, a scarab. Third one. Same spot. Another scarab. Fourth one. Pretty much the same spot. There's a scarab. Fifth. A scarab again in the same spot where figure 3 is. And then lastly, the sixth one, there's a scarab in the exact same spot. Can you believe that? All 6 of the 6 hypocephali on this website have a scarab drawn where figure 3 is supposed to be, which Joseph Smith said was the throne of God. Every single one of them. And unless you forgot, the scarab represented the constellation Cancer, which the Sumerians called the throne of Anu. How in the heck did Joseph know this? Could he have known this? How is he so spot on? It's a flipping bullseye. Smoking gun, I'd say. Not only for Cancer, but for Sirius being Kolob too. It's amazing. Whew. Now, I know that was a long one, and thanks for sticking around for the end. I hope you learned something new. There is a whole lot more that I couldn't fit in this episode, but we'll save for part 2. So if you're interested in learning more about Kolob in the real universe, subscribe to Mormon Theories so you don't miss it. I believe that the very best theory based on the evidence is that Kolob is Sirius, that Oliblish is Alnitak in Orion's belt, and that the throne or residence of God is in the Beehive Cluster. And I believe that looking at Kolob as being Sirius is a key that will unlock the rest of the astronomy contained in the Gale. The Gale has 15 fixed stars and 15 planets that need to be identified. This key has already helped me identify some of them. Will we be able to figure out the rest? Again, thanks for watching. You're awesome. Check out my other stuff on X, YouTube, and Facebook at Mormon Theories or my blog, or listen to the audio podcast on Apple and Spotify. Remember that truth is Mormonism and God is the author of it. Go get all the good in the world and come out a pure Mormon. Until next time.